is in this section of a poem called Meditations in a Time of Civil War, which is a reflection of the Civil War in Ireland in the 1920s, which I think speaks to the themes that I want to evoke here. So bear with me, inhabit this couple of stanzas, enjoy the space in the morning. If you did have a late night, let the poetry wash over you. And I'm going to try and tease out the various themes in this. Okay. Forgive me, I'm going to read this as well as I can. The bees build in the crevices of loosening masonry, and there the mother birds bring grubs and flies. My wall is loosening, honeybees. Come build in the empty house of the stair. We're closed in and the key is turned on our uncertainty. Somewhere a man is killed or a house burned, yet no clear fact to be discerned. Come build in the empty house of the stair. A barricade of stone or of wood, some 14 days of civil war. Last night they trundled down the road, that dead young soldier in his blood. Come build in the empty house of the stair. We'd fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmities than in our love. Oh honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. And it's a wonderful poem, I think, full of a sense of danger, of destruction, even of violence, of limitations, of boundaries. But there is also a sense of possibility, a sense of actually how things can recover and be made anew. And I find in that poem this reflection on a very difficult time in Irish history, something that I want to draw out in terms of the questions of democracy. Now, I think one of the things that is most remarkable when we begin to think of social change is just how much fear surrounds that. We are so, we're propelled forward by all these endless revolutions in technology and culture. And sometimes when I think about the pace of social change, which as Marx said, in an era when all that is solid melts into air, I think about Charlie Chaplin and Modern Times. Have people seen that wonderful film? And in one of the early scenes, he's got a job in a factory, but the pace of the assembly line is inhuman, is literally inhuman. So he gets twisted into it, and it becomes it's a comedy, but it's also a comment. And I think this is a very established theme, but I think at this particular moment, it's become even sharper. I think there's a few reasons for that. I think we face extraordinarily sharp inequalities. I think our world is defined by that. In Europe and further afield, but specifically in Europe, we're seeing a rise in xenophobia and racism, which it's pretty much unprecedented for the past, since in the post-war period. It's very, very, very worrying. And at our shoulder, at my shoulder, I'm a young father, is that fear, that thing that we all know, that global warming is happening. It's a fact. That we are on the verge, potentially, of an ecological catastrophe. So there's a lot of, when we think about our times, it's bound up in fear. Does that resonate with you? Yeah. Now, I think that's come from somewhere, and it's an important thing to pay attention to, but I very much want to move in this keynote away from that. There's a cultural commentator, Frederic Jameson, who says, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than alternatives, more just alternatives to the world we live in. And I think that's very, very, very problematic. I think if we only vest ourselves in fear and in pessimism, we get pinned into a narrowness that actually means that we can't act, okay? And there's a quote by Edward Said, the wonderful Palestinian critic, which I think evokes the type of challenges we face and we need to think about, which takes a bit more hope. And he says, if we think about our societies and education systems, we need to think about how to match the new economic and socio-political dislocations and configurations of our time with the startling realities of human interdependence. It's human, how do we move beyond fear into a space which allows us to actually do something creative and open? And my own response to that has been to think, using the tools of critical theory and critical realism, that, and we can talk about that in the panel session if you want, what that specifically means. But it's to actually try and approach things imaginatively. And I have a specific understanding of what that means. That's to inhabit things, to really tease out how a particular moment comes into being. So that's going to be the first part of my keynote, which is to say, well, how did we get into this situation? What's causing what's lying underneath it? But also to see where the other possibilities are, what's emergent, what's going on that we know from this very present moment or from history that we can say, well, actually there's a different direction, okay? So what you're going to hear is that critical excavation of this particular moment linked to an imaginative desire to move beyond that. Okay. And I'm going to bring up that big word. Probably, I don't know if in your particular circles neoliberalism is discussed very commonly. When I first started doing research on neoliberalism, nobody knew what it meant. Now everyone uses it to mean everything, okay? It's sort of, there was no in-between point. It was hopelessly obscure and then became highly overused. But I think it does, it is a word which is very important, and if we want to grasp the challenges of this moment, I think we need to flesh that out and say, well, what is neoliberalism and what has its effects been? It has a very clear political history now in neoliberalism. It begins in think tanks, in universities, associated with free market thinking, people like Hayek, von Mises, etc., Milton Friedman. And it moves out of the universities into states, in Chile, under the Pinochet regime, under Reagan, under Thatcher, through to the Washington Consensus, and it has spread globally. And I think that's one of the extraordinary things. It is an elite project which has spread the globe. And its key claim, I think, will be very familiar to you, because you hear this every day, that actually markets fix things. What we need to do is deregulate. We need to expand the reach of the market, even into areas of human life and activity which haven't been subjected to market pressures before. I mean, just to illustrate this, there's a book on markets written by Michael Sandel a couple of years ago, and he said, we've come to the stage where in certain county jails in America, you can get an upgrade on your cell. Okay. But there is this sort of things that 40 years ago nobody would imagine market forces playing out in are now subjected to market forces. The other bit of the neoliberal claim that's important is that not only will this help us economically, lead to economic growth, tap human creativity, it will also maximize freedom. It will also give greater choice to us all. And part of what I want to do in this discussion or in this keynote is to problematize that and come back to actually a different notion of freedom. Okay. It is important to say that when we discuss neoliberalism, it isn't simply one thing. It's emerged in a very complex way in relation to technology in different socio-political spaces. So what neoliberalism, say, in an Irish context is very different from neoliberalism in a South African context. But there is, I think, a clear architecture of power that's emerged in the past 30, 40 years, all of which has a bearing on the question of democracy. The first is, and I've already alluded to this, is that the role of the state in relation to the market has been totally reimagined. The state is not there for welfare functions primarily. It's there to facilitate business and economic competitiveness. And that means privatization, it means marketization, it means changing the rules by which we approach things like welfare. And I think that is a very familiar feature of policy making across the world. Now, it's not simply a reimagination of the state and market relationship, it is also a reimagining of the relationship of states to international governmental organizations. I'm thinking about the IMF, I'm thinking about the World Bank, I'm thinking about the European Central Bank as we watch the news from Greece. And there's also a reimagination or a reconfiguration of the relationship between the state and corporations. Now, somewhere early in the 2000s, at the turn of the new millennium, big corporations became more powerful than nation states. There's a lot of ways of judging that, but of the 100 largest economic entities in the world, at that period, it shifted to 52 of them being corporations. And this has changed the architecture of power globally. This affects decision-making globally. A very important part of this story as well, and this is absolutely fundamental to what's happened in Europe over in a period of austerity, has been the financialization of everyday life. And that doesn't just mean that banks and financial traders have become more powerful, it's that the relationships to credit and debt have penetrated our life in a totally new way. And that is all over the past 40 years. That, you know, the emergence of the use of credit cards, the expanding use of mortgages as a thing to speculate upon. At the same time, to put this architecture of power into place, you needed to undermine bodies and organizations which didn't stand for that. Okay? And I'm thinking very much about the collectivist organizations of the working class. And we saw you can map that out in Chile, and you can map that out in Europe. I am also thinking about indigenous people being dispossessed from their land. I'm also thinking about those collectivist social movements, including feminism, which actually asked for a different type of freedom. So there's been a pushback. And I think we are now in a position 30 or 40 years into this neoliberal revolution, this elite project, to say what the impacts of it are. And I think it has weakened social solidarity, it's encouraged competitive individualism, it's increased precarity, by which I mean the increased use of zero-hour contracts, the lack of security at work, the lack of security with welfare. And this is the crucial one. However you measure this, in terms of income, in terms of wealth, in terms of wage share across the economy, there has been a remarkable sharpening of the gaps in inequality. So in Ireland, I think Ireland has an economic structure which is quite Anglo-Saxon. It's quite like America. We're talking about between 34 and 40% of the wealth held by 1%. You will find similar figures in the UK and the US. And the evidence has mounted for this as the years have gone by. And I think that changes in wealth, along with that new architecture of power that I tried to sketch out, has changed the way decisions get made on our planet. Okay? And I think it has redistributed wealth and power upwards. And frankly, I think this has led us into the present era of austerity and polycrisis. Now, polycrisis is a term used by a Greek philosopher, Douzinos. And he says, when you look at our contemporary world, it's not good enough just to talk about inequality or austerity or unemployment. It's like a set of Russian dolls. And at the far reach of that is the ecological crisis. Now, as a group of educators, you will want to know what relationship does this have to education. And the slide starts with the broadest on the top and moves to the most micro elements at the bottom. At the broadest level, I think neoliberalism functions as a public pedagogy, as Henry Giroux says. That is, we are compelled, both through watching things like Survivor or The Apprentice, these products in everyday culture, we're compelled to sort of learn the lesson of competitive individualism again and again and again. It's built into our policies and our institutions. It's permeating everyday life. Now that might seem very broad. I think there is a more definite sense in which neoliberalism has affected education, and that's through the marketization of education. It is, as Stephen Ball says, one of the extraordinary changes in education systems worldwide. Now, not all of it, it's not working as pure markets, it's markets and quasi-markets. But I think it's in shifting, our educational imagination that the major thing has happened. And we're beginning to think and act as if a student needs to become a debtor to get credentials. And we're beginning to think of our educational institutions as entrepreneurial. That's not quite an enormous shift. Linked to this, despite the claims of neoliberalism to free us from bureaucracy, from the dead grey hand of the state, actually we've never been so tangled up in paper and bureaucracy. There is a new managerialism which I think is best expressed as an audit culture, where everything has to be pinned down and worked through. It is, as the wonderful Spanish poet Lorca said, we're in a mire of law and figures. I was talking to a Canadian adult educator at a conference in Warwick during the week, and she said that literacy workers in her area, in her state in Canada, now spend 50% of their time filling out forms, which produces data that they never use. That is extraordinary, right? This is happening worldwide, and I think it's happening for a reason. Now, I think that new managerialism has also shifted, also given us coordinates for imagining education. And that's the student as client, okay? Sometimes an angry client, sometimes a happy client, but a client nevertheless. And for educators, you become a performer, and you are only as good as your last performance, okay? So I think these are very, very profound things. And certainly, I'd be very interested to hear what people have to say at this conference, but certainly in Ireland, the use of qualification frameworks is a big part of this. And there's a very, very interesting book by Stephanie Elias, which has gone into the history and evolution of qualification frameworks, particularly linked to outcomes-based notions of learning. And she says that they have mushroomed at the same period that I'm saying is the neoliberal period. And I don't think that's at all accidental. From 20 countries to 120 countries. And the message of qualification frameworks at the moment is you have to make education more immediately relevant to the economy. And I think very importantly, it's also saying our reforms are anti-elitist. It's for freedom. We want to be student-centered. That's what it, and that's a very big claim for these qualification frameworks. But the evidence is that they are not necessarily working the way it's claimed. Okay. Now, I think you hear where I'm going with this. I think these broader shifts and changes and these specific changes in education have done something to our educational imagination, our capacity to think beyond the here and now. And it's as Gert Biesta says, the questions of the purpose and value of education, why we give our lives to education, why we go in every day, are being lost. And we're getting caught up with technical and managerial questions about the efficiency and effectivenesses of processes, not what these processes are for. Now, I think that does two things. As somebody, I'm, as you can hear, very concerned about social justice. I think that actually cuts off our head. It limits our capacity to talk about social justice. It's just not in there. Even if you don't agree with that particular take, that particular understanding of what education is for, I think it also misunderstands the nature of learning. Learning is not linear, it's layered. It's not totally predictable, it's complex. And I think we're being invited to think about learning in a very simplistic way. Okay. Now, that is the excavation of neoliberalism and education as far as I see it. And I'd be very happy later in the panel to explore that with you. Now, I think one of the problems with the way we talk about neoliberalism is it's turned into this, it's almost like the Death Star from Star Wars, okay? It's this extraordinarily dark, complete force, and it's not. It's limited and fractured and under pressure. And I think that's very important for us in terms of this work reimagining education. Okay, I think on a very simple level, it doesn't do what it claims to do. It doesn't maximize freedom. It does not create wealth, I can tell you, having lived through 7 years of austerity in Ireland, that this is not a straightforward thing. It doesn't realize its own promises. I think there's a much bigger question about human well-being, as Amartya Sen and as Martha Nussbaum talk about, which has been ignored in this era. I also think has not given us the global architecture to address challenges. I'm thinking both of inequality, but I'm also thinking about climate change. It's just, we do not have the structures which are going to tackle this. Now, behind this, I think, and this isn't said often enough, but was said by the wonderful economic historian and adult educator, Karl Polanyi, who wrote an extraordinary book called The Great Transformation. And he said, when people tell you that the market will self-regulate, what they're inviting you into is a fantasy land, because human beings don't work like that. We are not individualistic monads careering around the world trying to maximize our own self-interest. We need care, we need community, we need various values. And he calls it a stark utopia. So that's a bigger claim. I'm saying that I think neoliberalism is founded on a threadbare and weak ontology. Now, this is where it becomes less about my particular analysis and more about, well, actually what's happening in response to this. And I think this isn't said often enough as well, that the failures of neoliberalism have led to a very, very widespread ferment of contestation. And I don't think it's at all accidental that the two great themes in that contestation have been, well, let's do something about inequality, and let's think about how to reinvent democracy. And it's particularly the reinvention of democracy that I'm interested in. And I want to go into this a little bit deeper with you. I think the question of democracy is fundamental. I think it's fundamental to how neoliberalism justifies itself. I think contradictions in liberal democracies and what neoliberalism has done has created a crisis in liberal democracies, by which I mean constitutional representative states with constitutions and laws which are based on majority decisions. Okay? I think it's created a crisis in that, and the response from global civil society has been to say, well, we still need democracy and we need new terms for it. And the terms for that are participatory and deliberative. Now I'll go through each of those arguments in turn. Okay. First, to the question that liberal democracies are under pressure. I'm basing this on quite a range of readings, both within critical theory, but also social movement studies, studies on democracy. And from that reading, I think that there's at least four major pillars that support liberal democracy, or have supported liberal democracy. And first is political parties that compel our trust, that have large numbers of citizens joining them, that become spaces in which you can go and shape identities and feel that you're having some sort of role in the state. Now, internationally, those type of political parties are diminishing. We're seeing populist movements and different types of forces emerge, not all which are progressive. But those type of stable political parties are receding. The second thing, and this has always been a little bit of this has not been correct, especially if you're from the global south, but the idea that the nation state is an obvious and clear arena of political power is under pressure. If we think about, we've been watching the news yesterday, today, this is precisely what's happening in Greece. It's precisely what was happening in Ireland, precisely what happens across the world, is that it is not straightforward to say that the nation state is the place where decisions can be kept and held to. And I think that really does create challenges for democracy. Both in social democratic states and in liberal states, there was a commitment to reducing or mitigating social inequality. And I think neoliberalism has completely undermined that. The idea that the state would look after the weakest and the most vulnerable has been blown away. And that is, I think that really undermines the capacity to do things within a liberal democracy and envisage it as a future. Very importantly, and this is very closely linked to education. I think in the post-war period, in a very stable era, there were very, very wide and multiplying opportunities, particularly in the global north and in Europe, for self-realization. There was opportunities for self-realization. I think precarity, I think workfare are all undermining that. I think actually even the way education is imagined and used is undermining that. So if I'm correct, and those four aspects are under pressure because of neoliberalism, because of a longer history, then this is a very serious question. But as Hilary Wainwright notes, a very interesting social movement scholar, she says, when old institutions fail, people invent. And I think that strikes me as quite right. And in global social fora, in the alternative globalization movements, on the streets in Spain, in Kurdistan, in Bolivia, in Brazil, in Mexico, at least in parts of Mexico, what you have is this extraordinary emergence and convergence around the idea of participatory, deliberative democracy. I think our age has suggested an alternative global theme. And this isn't from one ideological position. This is very important. This is people coming from old social movements and new social movements. You know, from indigenous people and from trade unionists in Western Europe. And there's a ferment of activity which is saying, look, we can't just sit here. We need to do something about this. Democracy is important, and we have to go flesh that out and inhabit that in new sorts of ways. So to give you some concrete examples, I'm thinking in experiments, things like participatory budgeting in Brazil, which is spread internationally. And that's a way of citizens engaging and setting the criteria and outcomes for local councils. I'm thinking about the international social fora where people come together to deliberate on our future. I'm thinking about, and this is probably the one that is in people's imagination most quickly, I'm thinking about Occupy, which went from a tiny little protest to something that mushroomed around the world. Now, it didn't have stability, it didn't last, but it did take up these themes, and I don't think it's accidental that these themes keep re-emerging. And key to the idea of participatory democracy is that you get to be a Democrat not just once every 4 or 5 years. You're a Democrat in every part of your life, in education, in community, even in the workplace. And that majority decisions aren't always the best way of working things out. At certain points, there has to be extended deliberation, discussion. That part of the vitality of democracy depends on our capacity to talk to each other about what we share, but also where we differ. And I think that's a very, very interesting proposal. Now for me, both as somebody interested in the history of democratic education, but also what we might do in the future, I'm very taken by the fact that everywhere, and it doesn't matter if it is Brazil or it's Kurdistan, everywhere there's an organic link made between learning, education, and the health of democracy. And of course, you've heard this all before, haven't you? Because everyone who's an educator reads Dewey, more or less first week of their diploma course, or however, your teacher training course. Democracy in education. He said this in 1916. He said, actually, if you want a good, healthy democracy, it's a learning space, that it happens in communities, not just in set institutions. Despite the fact that there's a lot of hot air about new social media, a lot of exaggerations, I don't think we can ignore it. And I think this is part of this new global effort to reimagine democracy. And things are happening with a speed and level of alacrity that is very new. People are coming together, and all the examples I'm giving, things like the movement of the squares in Spain or Occupy, were facilitated by this. Now, I don't think we should fetishize new social media, but what I do think is we should say, well, there's a promise for a new way of doing this, a new way of consulting with each other, and we need to thicken that out. Okay. Now, I'm going to finish what I have to say in 2 slides, and bear with me on this. This is a little bit knotty, this slide, okay? But it's for a reason. I think if you read through what's happening in this great ferment of activity across the world, if you read your history of adult education and you read your history of higher education, progressive forms of higher education, that there are certain principles which we can say, this is the basis, not the full story, but the basis of democratic education, which is very different, okay? Now the next slide will make it even more practical, so if people have questions like, well, that seems very well and good, you know, how does this actually work? I will get to that, but let's say that I think they are these 6 things. First of all, equality has to be built in at the very beginning of educational work. Not just it as the end goal. It has to be an assumption. When you meet people who come into an educational space to work with you, you approach them as a full equal. When you work with your colleagues, you approach them as a full equal. And that does something. Jacques Rancière writes very interestingly about what that does. The French philosopher Jacques Rancière wrote a book called The Ignorant Schoolmaster. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian adult educator, also extraordinary, also says what that does when you presume somebody is an equal to you. And what actually that means is you have to keep practicing it. It's not one thing, it's not just the sentiment, you have to find a way of practicing it. And you are also moving towards equality. But if you give any serious thought, as the Irish scholars Baker and Lynch have, to what we mean by equality, you know that it's very complex. It's lots of dimensions. It's not simply about moving to equality in terms of money or income. That's not. It's a much more complex thing than that. It's about moving towards equality where we have access to valued social practices, where we can get to fulfill our capabilities within reason. Okay. Now, I think if you take that notion of equality seriously, you are then drawn to actually saying, well, how do you institute this through some sort of thinking about democracy? And I don't think it can be simply a Likert scale survey from your students. How did I do? How did you do? Rate my teacher, rate my institution. It has to be much richer and more difficult because of that. So I think we need a thick notion of democracy. And that means it's experimental. It means that we're trying to find ways of communicating where we arrive at, as Dewey says, a conjoint feeling. That it does something to how we feel about and talk about ourselves. We explore the possibilities of democracy. And that's very challenging because it means institutions have to evolve. In that, it's not just about participation, it is about deliberation. It's about offering reasons for things and allowing them to be disputed. And I think in this great global world of ours, we have to say that difference and dissent are absolutely crucial to democracy. It is not about imposing consensus. I think educational spaces have to function, if they are to function for democracy and freedom, they have to function as spaces of recognition in at least 2 ways. They have to offer a space for people to understand themselves and what they desire, to understand common interests and how to act on those common interests. But also, and I think this is something that Axel Honneth, the critical theorist, talks a lot about, but I think is an insight which is derived mainly from feminism. We have to realize that we are intersubjective beings. We're vulnerable, we're needy, we rely on care, and when we come into any educational space, all of that plays out. And intersubjectivity means realizing both people's vulnerabilities, but the fact that if we're unfinished, we become different and better through others. Okay? And you can hear why I'm positing that in opposition to the type of notion of the lone individual offered by the neoliberal fantasy. Okay. This has enormous implications for how we view knowledge. It means knowledge is contingent and fallible. It doesn't mean that disciplines and subjects get thrown out, but it means there's a meta function to how we approach knowledge, that there always has to be space for critically remaking it. And I think that's very exciting, because I think that's where innovation comes in education. You say, okay, where is that margin of freedom? How do we remake our own practices? I think everything I'm saying means that we need permeable institutions. They need to be able to talk with and to communities. They need to work across various landscapes in the surroundings of an educational institution. They have to talk to campaigns and citizens groups. And all of these things mean that we are coming to a notion of freedom based on interdependence and autonomy, which is not simplistic, which is rich, and which freedom is not simply, oh, the freedom to choose this or that commodity. It's a basic human desire to tap into curiosity and creativity, which can remake both ourselves, our students, and the world. Now, that's all very grand. I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of difficulties with that, but I also want to say that this type of democratic conception has a maximal and minimal interpretation. We can do things with a democratic notion of education on a very small level. It doesn't have to be across a state, you know, it doesn't have to be across a region, but we can begin to reimagine things on an everyday level. I do think this means that our institutions have to be more open and transparent, but it's the messy business of negotiating that. It's not simply come once a year and see how the school or the college is working. It's a much more open and tricky and rich process. I think you'll hear very clearly that I think that it means we have to bring back the questions of the ethics of education, the purpose of education, the philosophy of education, right back to what we're doing. And I'm making a claim for democracy and freedom. I think there's a very tricky bit of work which is ongoing to develop a properly global set of curricula, to be able to respond to local needs and global concerns. I think if you were saying that knowledge is open, contestable, and negotiated, this is a very big deal. But once again, I would note that that is a space for creativity. And I think it means, as I said, as Roncière and Freire said, it means at the very, very least approaching every educational encounter as an equal with equals. So I don't think what I've discussed over the course of this keynote, the difficulties of neoliberalism, the possibilities of democratic education, I don't think this is a given. This is an emergent possibility in our world. There's a lot of gaps and obstacles in the way. But I do think at the beginning of a conference like this, where we want to talk about community environment, we have to take very, very seriously the idea that we can't simply do things as they've been done, and we have to look for the pulse of freedom, where there's a capacity for democracy and freedom in our world. So thank you very much.